paperwork never goes away. So still people had to fill out forms and do all this stuff, but they weren't really getting any health care. Well, and physicians who had once been advocates for the patient now have become partners of the state. It was a gradual creep. It took about 40 years, but they now were, most doctors now work for the government. Well, they then enter the Nazis, okay? And here are the Nazi principles of medicine. And I will tell you, doctors don't always make good decisions. We were the #1 we were the #1 group. If you took by, bricklayers and doctors were the #1 profession to support Hitler. So there you go. And they did it for this reason, because they liked these things. There was an emphasis on prevention. Everybody hears that today. We should do preventive medicine, right? No smoking. I hate smoking, but they wrote Hitler was a rabid anti-smoker and wrote the first no smoking arms. They believed in clean air, pure food, and exercise. What's to hate about that? Here's the kicker. They also believed in rational allocation of resources. Now that sounds good, right? We shouldn't just throw away our resources. If you build electric light bulbs and you're a manufacturer and you find out that 40-watt light bulbs don't sell, but 100-watt light bulbs do sell, what's a rational allocation of my resources? Well, it's moving my funds into producing 100-watt light bulbs. But in medicine, what does this really say? And I got to tell you, this exact phrase was on the wall of my hospital in Arizona at one time when I was chief of staff. And I objected to it, saying, that could be your motto, but it's not my motto. Rational allocation of resources in medicine, healthcare, means I can avoid treating you guys to treat them. I can take away your health care because you're older and I need to give it to more productive people. I can even maybe kill you if it will save these people. That's the utilitarian ethic applied to health care. And that's rational. That's what we're talking about when we talk about rational allocation. Okay, well, into this milieu, the young Karl Brandt became a surgical resident, and he studied with a very famous surgeon. Anybody knows Sauerbruch? And his date with destiny happened when his fiancée and he were driving up to Hitler's place up in the mountains, because his fiancée was an Olympic swimmer. Hitler liked the Olympians, so she was invited to lunch with him. So they were driving up, and there was this cavalcade of cars, and they were the last car, and the car ahead of them, driven with this guy in the back, drove off the road and into a ditch. And this guy was very severely injured. I can't remember his name, but he was one of the toadies around Hitler, and he was very severely injured, had a nucleated eyeball and an open tibia fracture, all this stuff. And Karl Brandt, being a trauma surgeon, jumped out of his car, resuscitated the guy, put him in his own car, drove him to a hospital, and for the next month of his summer break, he took care of him. He would come up, at this point, Karl Brandt was a fairly well-known Berlin surgeon, but he took the time to come and take care of this guy every day, and Hitler was so impressed that he said, I'd like you to be on my staff, because Hitler was always afraid about being assassinated, and he didn't have a surgeon on his staff, so he thought it'd be a good idea. So he gets him to be on his staff, and Karl Brandt became one of the technocrats like Albert Speer. Hitler had kind of the toadies around him, the people that just kind of didn't do much but sucked up the air and the champagne, and then he had people like Speer and Brandt that actually made the country run. Well, Karl Brandt was not your typical bureaucrat. He really would get out. He would go to the Eastern, during the war, he would go to the Eastern Front, find out they had problems with numbers of surgeons taking care of the wounded, and he'd roll up his sleeves and operate. I mean, this was, like I say, I like Karl Brandt. He was a good guy, actually. But what he found is that and if anybody's been in the military, you talk about echelons of care. So the first echelon of care up at the front, we could save these soldiers. But then when they got back to Germany, all the hospitals had been flattened by Allied bombing in the major cities. So there was no place to go, and these guys were dying, and their civilians were dying for lack of care. So Karl Brandt went to Hitler and said, hey, look, we got to reform this system. We're not taking care of these guys, and they're dying for no reason. We could be doing better. And he says, there are these psychiatric hospitals out away from the main centers in these kind of pastoral settings. We could easily turn into trauma hospitals and then take better care of the people. Hitler said, well, make it so. And unfortunately, Brandt couldn't get anything done because of the fiefdoms of all the bureaucrats. So he said, I got to have some authority to do this. And Hitler said, you are now the chief doctor in Nazi Germany, the Reich Minister for Health Affairs. And that's what started this whole thing. So he moved everything out. It really did help. They started saving people. But here's the problem. They had to move these psychiatric patients who now were not being cared for by their families, because remember, government charity had replaced private charity. So they were being taken care of by these government doctors in these government facilities, and they got moved to even a lower echelon of care. When the medical care ran out, they were the first ones to not get medical care. Okay. Well, but then the food ran out. This is the war, and they were not having a lot of food produced, and so they needed the food for their soldiers and for their productive people in the war armaments. So they didn't send the food to these hospitals, and these patients started to starve. So the doctors that were taking care of them were really in a bad spot, and they called up into Berlin and they said, you've got to help us. Starvation is a terrible way to go, it really is. They said, we don't want to see our patients starve. We would rather give them a gentle death. And with that, Karl Brandt signed the euthanasia order to let them euthanize these patients rather than let them starve, and signed his own death warrant. The physicians were stuck in the middle. But Karl Brandt went to the gallows believing this, that when the health of the nation is at issue, the health of the individual doesn't matter. In other words, I can kill you to save the state. That's really what this means. And he believed that because that's what he was taught. That's what everybody there grew up with. It was a utilitarian ethic that philosophically came from Plato to Kant to Hegel. If you read Leonard Peikoff's book, Ominous Parallels, he's telling you how it's happening here. And that we were spared by many years from this because we didn't have the Hegelian tradition of philosophy in this country, but it's coming. Mark Roth is a lawyer, and he wrote this brief in a Supreme Court brief, and it's a really good point. The German experience in physician-assisted death was the direct result of utilitarian cost-benefit analysis and the view within the medical community that the value of human life is relative, that some persons are better off dead. It was not the result of jackbooted thugs in brown shirts. I will tell you, physicians at every step in Nazi Germany ran the death camps. They were there at the gas chambers making sure people were dead. They were there at the terminus of the railway to decide who died and who went to the work camps. They were there at the euthanasia of the gypsies and the imbeciles and all the people that they didn't like. They could not have done this if it hadn't been for us. And this is why this is such an important lesson. I give this talk, a big talk just on this to medical students, by the way. Now, Alfred Hoche was a psychiatrist, and he wrote a book called, The Permission of Life, the Permission of Destruction of Life Not Worthy of Life. And it was essentially, how do we set up a euthanasia program? And he envisioned a government body of doctors that would be lawyers and psychiatrists, and they'd all get together to oversee a patient's economic value to society. Somebody was telling me a story earlier about this happening here, and applying cost-benefit criteria, i.e. you're too old, we're not going to dialyze you, i.e. you're going to die, we're just going to let you die. Now, if you don't think this is coming here, let me wake you up. You know, Ezekiel Emanuel was brother of Rahm Emanuel, now the mayor of Chicago, but once Obama's chief of staff. He wrote in the Lancet in 2009, he wrote an article called The Disability Adjusted Life Year. And he and his authors envision this situation where you can just hear them saying, when we finally get a hold of all of medical care, we're going to have to figure out how to distribute it fairly. And we recommend using the Disability Adjusted Life Year. And this is an exact quote from the paper. He says the Disability Adjusted Life Year allocation treats life years given to elderly or disabled people as objectively less valuable. Now think about that. How can one human being say your life is objectively less valuable? And this is a Jewish guy. This is a Jewish physician. What did he not learn? It's like, I want to say, Ezekiel, baby, where were you in 1942? But it always works when it's in your hands. That was the Nazis. It's not, we're not, no. I had a Jewish doctor come up and criticize me for making this point. He said, how can you say that about Ezekiel? I said, I'm not bad-mouthing Ezekiel as a person, but he's got the wrong idea. I mean, this is a bad idea. Basically, it's called the complete life system. And if you're under 2, or if you're over 60, or you have a terminal illness, you might as well just bend over and kiss your ass goodbye, because you're not going to get any health care dollars in the future. Okay, here's another story of our time. In the 1940s, when the Nazis marched into Holland, they wanted the Dutch doctors to participate in their euthanasia program.